Welcome to Ivy League Murders, where we deep dive on cases related to academia. My name is Sarah Alcorn. I'm a Harvard graduate and a private investigator.
My name is Laura Rodriguez McDonald. I'm a University of Miami grad, longtime crime aficionado, and part of a fourth-generation NYPD family.
Laura and I don't always agree on everything. With her NYPD roots and my criminal defense background, sometimes we find ourselves on opposite sides of the jury. We do share a mutual passion for crime solving, and we both grew up in Cambridge, steps away from Harvard University. In Ivy League Murders, we discuss cases where the best of the best make the worst decisions. We look at people who seemingly have it all and throw it all away. Cornell University, located in the lush beauty of Ithaca, New York, is known for its international and progressive approach to academics. It was the 1970s. Bell-bottomed students traipsed across the elegant grounds, chatting about majors, smoking pot, and discussing their hopes that Jimmy Carter could maybe bring a real change to American politics. Weaved amongst them was a quiet, awkward agricultural engineering major. He was already stalking, picking out women, following them, and getting a perverse thrill in scaring them. He is Ivy League serial killer named Michael Bruce Ross.
Wow, well, Sarah, we are doing the Cornell serial killer this week, which is a case I always think I'm familiar with most cases. I really was completely unfamiliar with this case.
Absolutely, and I think I just want to remind our listeners that this is a true crime podcast. This is a very brutal, we go into murders, serial murders, sexual violence.
Violence against children.
And it's definitely listener warning.
We really try in this podcast not to dwell on the actual act of violence and to look more at the reasons behind that.
Exactly.
Why don't we just get right to it, Sarah? Thanks for everyone for hanging in there with us. We, with our editor Joe, have put a lot of work into trying to fix our audio, so hopefully things are going to sound a lot better this week.
That's right. And there's tons of people, but they're just in tremendous amounts of support going on, and we're super grateful for that.
This podcast community is...
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Laura and I were joking around that it's people like from all walks of life. And, Laura and I were joking around like, we are the world, because it's like even like the true crime podcasting world and beyond. What are some of the stranger podcasts that or not stranger, but the themes outside of true crime that you have explored?
There's plumbing podcasts.
I love it.
There is a niche for everybody.
But a couple of your favorites. I think Before Words, I think we got to do a
Casey from Before Words. Yeah, I listened to that with Lily, and who's my daughter, who's 18, and it's just so exciting that somebody would get her that into words.
Well, but explain. These are like 5-minute segments of going into the etymology of certain words, and the guy is funny, and he does a great job, and they're like little word candies in a funny way.
Oh, right. I love Zach from Drinks with Great Minds in History. I mean, what a brilliant podcast that is.
And we've had a couple of people do wonderful shout outs and run our promos, Murder and Such, on episode 67, and we listened to it, and fantastic.
I'm a huge Hunter fan. I love Murder and Such, so that's a real honor. And I have to give a shout out to my podcast mentor, Nicole, at Quite Unusual podcast, because she's been so helpful and really walking me through the audio and the day-to-day struggles, and their podcast is phenomenal. Another one I'm able to listen to with my daughter, and we just have a blast listening to the Elisa Lam case together, and it was so well done.
Oh, yeah.
And they're funny, and I'm getting kind of coolness credibility from all these podcasters I'm connected with my daughter, so there's many more.
And there's Backroads as well.
Backroad Legends, phenomenal. JC.
We are the world.
Ross at Missing Molly. I mean, there's so many, but I could go on and on and on with my Academy Award speech. So let's
talk about Michael Bruce Ross.
Right. Let's get down to some true crime.
Ross was born July 26th in 1959 in Brooklyn, Not the Brooklyn you're thinking of, okay? Brooklyn spelled the same way in Connecticut. And Brooklyn's a small rural town of about 8,000. It was a middle-class farming community, and he was born to a very young couple who were married right out of high school, right? Daniel and Pat Ross.
Weren't they married due to an unplanned pregnancy?
Unplanned pregnancy. And so Pat Ross, his mother, she hated this small rural farm community, and she never stopped really blaming Michael, right, for trapping her in this existence that she hated. And she had 3 more children after that. The marriage was terrible, right? It was super rocky.
And she had some mental illness, and she was hospitalized several times because she had thoughts of suicide and of harming the children. So she was very abusive mentally and physically to Ross. I mean, he was a bedwetter. She used to hang out his sheets to humiliate him.
It's awful. He was a bedwetter until his early teens.
Yeah, until adolescence.
Right? Yes.
She eventually ran off with another man briefly to North Carolina, and then did come back and got hospitalized, but they do eventually get divorced.
And now Ross was sexually assaulted by an uncle at a very young age, right?
I think between like 5 and 8 he was he was raped and sexually abused by his uncle. When Ross was 8, his uncle, who was 16 at the time, committed suicide, and he left a note, and in the note he blamed his suicide on the fact he couldn't live anymore because of his homosexuality.
Oh, it's so
he
awful.
didn't admit to the sexual abuse. He
basically blames the victim.
Right.
I think one of the marked things that about Ross is he grew up on this farm, and I think at the age of 8, his job was to pick out the weak chickens and throttle their necks. And he later on says that this was a precursor to his sort of violence later on. Imagine an 8-year-old kid having that duty. I know farm life is farm life. My dad grew up on a farm, and I think there's a certain reality about killing animals when you live on a farm, but I can't imagine assigning that duty to an 8-year-old boy.
Ross, early on, and we know this because he talks about it, he starts to get some sexual satisfaction, some sexual arousal from killing the animals. There's
early on, there's indicators that he's just not,
And there's a connection with sex and violence. So this is something that these obsessive thoughts start for him very young. He says that this starts to happen about this time. So it's not so much, that he had to, in my opinion, kill the animals because he lived on a farm, but it's that he enjoyed killing the animals. Right.
So like indicator number 1, bedwetting, harming animals because that was your job at 8. But he was also highly intelligent. Ross did extremely well in school. He had a high IQ. He was a high achiever, but he gets himself into Cornell at this point.
Yeah, and let's just say about high school, he was able to maintain friendships, he had a relationship.
And we have to say that Ross presented very normally. He was a nice-looking guy. He was mild-mannered. He's frightening because I think if you had met him or he had been in your high school, you would never know what he would become.
Yeah, he reminds me a little bit of Bundy. Not quite as charismatic.
So Cornell, Laura, is basically the perfect hunting ground for Ross. And he's increasingly consumed with violent fantasies. He began stalking women and getting a thrill out of their fear. And so this is Ross in his own chilling words.
Stalk women. Then when I got to college, somehow these started degrading, going into more violent fantasies. That's when my rape fantasies first started, was when I was in college. I started following women home, and I would get a thrill by them knowing that I was following them, that they would be scared, and that gave me a thrill. And then it got to the point where I actually raped someone at Cornell, and then the next person I actually raped and killed.
I understand also Ross also at this time had a serious girlfriend who was a member of the ROTC, which is the military on campus. And she had an unplanned pregnancy, which ended in abortion.
Interestingly, he had a lot of guilt about, because he was raised Catholic, he had this kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. Interesting that he was able to disassociate in some ways, but still have this guilt. And he was also, something you may not know, he was a TA in college, which is a teacher's assistant.
Oh, God, that's